Israel is held up to a unique moral standard in the world that no other state has ever been held up to, where it is under constant attack, where its existence is militarily and diplomatically
it has committed genocide without sanction by anyone.
When it defends itself, it is held to a unique standard.
They acknowledge it. If you deny it, that's fine. But the Israelis do acknowledge it. They defend it. 80% of the society are saying this is legitimate, what they are doing to the men and women and children, not only to Hamas fighters.
You have the courage to talk about the genocide that is unfolding as we speak, because our generation's moral, ethical clarifier will be whether we can stand by the Palestinian people in the same way that in 1938, 1939, the moral clarifier for that era was whether we'll be able to stand by the Jewish people when they were facing
I must say, as somebody whose family were killed in the Holocaust, I find that comparison inappropriate. But
well, I find it absolutely appropriate, and we can agree to disagree on this.
As a young person, it's so hard for me to be optimistic, is because a lot of these workers are trading in their freedom for convenience. But we've seen the workers who took a stance, like for example for Palestine, right, against the Israeli genocide of Palestinians, they have faced major consequences. These tech companies are responsible for the technology being provided to target and kill Palestinians. Either it's AI to track facial recognition in the West Bank, or literally targeting civilian homes in Gaza. And when we see employees try to take a strong stance against it, or even as simple as putting a social media post, they're being silenced, they're being fired, there's no autonomy. What do you do in this case when you have literally the worst genocides happening in today's world against people of Gaza? How do you defend it without losing your livelihood?
Here I will agree with people who say, well, the situation we're facing today is not that different to the situation we faced in the past. There were tyrannies, forever. And there were young people who had to make the ethical choice at some point, either to conform, either to adapt themselves to the tyrant's wishes in order to move up in the world, or to clash with the tyrant, at the expense of even their life. Well, maybe you will lose your job at Google, but this is going to create a kind of internal process of real self-realization that will lead you to do something else, which will, in the end, produce a better life than the life of a well-remunerated Google employee.
I've praised the last few centuries of European Western history, but I can be very critical as well. When we look at the West today, there's a sense of complete chaos. There's a sense that people are not able to stand for anything. There's an enormous crisis of the traditional virtues: courage, independence, freedom of thought. If we look at the crisis in world politics today, if we look at Gaza, and we look how people in the West, not just politicians, because the tragedy is that it's not just politicians that are weak. People just don't stand up for things that they vaguely feel are wrong, but they don't have the convictions to know that they are wrong. They don't have the courage to stand up for those convictions. It's a moment of deep crisis, and we might as well admit it.
Sophie, Bruno seems to say that we're living through a sort of a civilizational unraveling. Do you agree?
I think there's always been this sort of creative and destructive urges going on within cultures and within cultures. I think that is just the nature of life. I think possibly when you're talking about the West or Europe, you're seeing this played out in a larger arena. And obviously you've got one element of the European Western modernity project became extremely kind of prolific and dominant on the world stage. So that tends to erase the fact that there are kind of lots of other diversities and variations. On issues like Gaza, yes, it's troubling that people have been so slow to just call the crime for what it is. However, in other situations surrounding any single one of the conflicts that we're seeing now is a long and a bloody history that goes beyond the immediate assailants and protagonists, even though that does not justify, obviously, what is being done.
Marwa, from what you heard, and what would you like to say to the students about Gaza?
Well, I think from what I heard and from what I lived, I come from a country that has been also war-torn. I mean, in Syria, the Syrian population paid a heavy price and they went through tragedies, perhaps not comparable to the current genocide that is taking place in Gaza, because of the relentless killing machine by the Israelis. But the students raised many important points when they gave the agency to the Gazan people, and that was very responsible and humble point of view. Palestinian people continue to live under the Israeli occupation, and it's an occupation that has an agenda to eradicate. It won't at any moment allow for space of genuine reconstruction. So to imagine a future while the knife of the killer is still on the necks of the Palestinian people would be unrealistic in my view. That only can take place in a future of peace, and it's a future that should be free. And unless there is freedom for Palestine, there cannot be a moment that could be compared to the aftermath of the World War II. For example, when you know the example of Japan and Germany was also mentioned through that debate. And I guess it's a different scenario in Palestine.
What's the difference between the Roman Empire, the Muslim Empire or empires, and let's say the liberal empires, beginning especially with the British Empire in India and elsewhere? The liberal empire is the only empire that tried not only to colonize and extract resources of the colonized, which every empire does. To that extent, I agree. But Europe is the only, because of its Christian history, is the only empire or set of empires that try to literally change the nature of the traditions and the humans that inhabit these traditions and make them European in its own image. Not all empires are the same. Jews and Christians and many others, and I'm one of the legacies of this long history, lived under Muslim rule for 1500 years. They remained Christian, they remained Jewish, they educated their children as they see fit, they defined their own sense of a human flourishing. And they became ministers and the big physicians of the court. The biggest traders, the richest people in Cairo were Christians and Jews. All I hear from you, and forgive me for saying this, all I hear is the regular stereotypical cliches that are circulating in the West, and we just keep repeating it. So begin to check every time you hear, is it true? Is it this? Is it
if
that?
we're talking about the history, though, I think the problem is that we're being far too generalizing here. Were there moments of religious pluralism in the Islamic world? Absolutely. But then, for example, if we take a look at the Umayyad Caliphate, the fact that non-Arabs who had just converted to Islam still had to pay jizya, for example, which is the whole reason that the Abbasid revolution began in the first place. Or, you know, I mean, the Ottomans, for example, the millet system is, for its time, a very progressive way of having religious pluralism. But I think today we would recognize that creating separate legal categories for every religion is not an efficient way to run a society.
I think you are idealizing the liberalism in integration.
Hang on. Liberalism,
let him finish.
The solution would be to go back.
I'm sorry. I think you are comparing apples with oranges here. You cannot just go to the United States and say, I am here, I am a Christian like you, so I'm an American. They will tell you no. Get out of here, especially now. And you have to go through the immigration naturalization. Naturalization in the modern state is conversion in the old days.
If you take the idea that we have no choice, that we have no moral agency to its end, we're coming out of a 2-year genocide that's continuing. And I've been following the trials of the IDF soldiers that were guilty of rape on camera, and they're pleading the defense that many criminals plead, which is I was just following orders. It was under compulsion. I had no choice of my own. And I think that once you strip us of our ultimate objective of existence, then you strip us of everything that is secondary to that as well. And you remove then any agency from the human being, and that's a worldview, that's a ditch that I don't think we can climb out of as human beings. I think that it strips us of our agency. I think that it also strips us of our potential, because what we've seen in the people of Gaza, you know, you just gave one example of your ability to overcome a difficult period in your life by looking at the circumstances that were given to you and responding in a certain way. What we've seen in the people of Gaza is that they have been able to hold two truths at the same time together, that my suffering is not without meaning, and that my suffering is entirely unjustifiable, that those who perpetrated the crime are unjustified in doing so, but that there is a redemption and there is a meaning and there is a purpose that I can find even in the most difficult circumstances that I've been in.
There's a dark side to the belief in free will. People tend to always look at the other aspects, the ones that are being highlighted here in this conversation. But there's empirical work that's been done that shows belief in free will correlates with increased punitiveness. So we punish people more harshly, and in a place like the United States, where we have mass incarceration and we have a very retributive criminal justice system, it's being driven primarily by this notion of retribution, which is grounded in this belief in free will. There's evidence that shows belief in free will is connected with acceptance of economic inequality. And it's tied to this belief in just desserts. If you end up in poverty, if you end up in prison, if you end up in some sort of suppressed or stratified social structure,
it's your fault.
It's your fault. And there's a lot of evidence that the belief in free will correlates with something called just world belief, that the world is just and good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. It sounds innocuous, it sounds like it isn't that dangerous a belief, but it actually manifests itself in a blame the victim approach.
Ian, will there always be a reason for us to go to war?
Well, I think, no, like Brian, I think war is not inevitable, but there are a lot of buts that go around that. And I think, to me, it seems like two big things are really important. One is that people are animals. And like almost all other species of animals, we've evolved to be able to use violence to get what we want in the world if we choose to do so. And so in that way, we're just like any other animal. But then there's also a way in which we're not like any other animal. Which is that our evolution has given us these big brains that are capable of cultural evolution as well as biological evolution. And we can decide how we do things. And we, so far as we know, alone in the entire world, we are the only animal that has changed the amount of violence it uses and the ways it uses it over time. And there's a lot of argument over the statistics. And I'm sure this is going to come up in the debate today. But the way I look at the evidence, people today, in spite of all the wars and the cruelty going on in the world, on average, globally, we are about 1/10 as likely to die violently as our ancestors in the Stone Age were. And I think we know how to drive down rates of violent death if we choose to do so. And so I think the possibility of a world without war is a real one, although, as I say, there's a lot of buts around that.
Charlie, what do you think?
I think conflict is inevitable, but violent conflict is not. I would agree with that. I hope it's not, because we're not living in the Stone Age anymore. We are living in a nuclear-armed world where even non-nuclear aerial weapons can do incredible damage to entire cities. We saw that in Dresden, Tokyo. We're seeing it in Gaza even. So if civilization is going to survive, we need very serious checks and balances on war. And that's what the United Nations Charter since 1945 has tried to do, limiting war to very specific last resort instances like self-defense. That's what the Geneva Conventions have tried to do since the mid-19th century, limiting how you can fight even a just war. You know, you can't target civilians, you shouldn't torture prisoners, you shouldn't use weapons that degrade the environment, etc. And these rules are what distinguish war from murder and from genocide. They've also, in statistical terms, helped keep the lid on not only interstate war, but especially great power war, the most deadly kind of war, for almost 80 years. And so I think abandoning those rules for a more untrammeled realpolitik would be a choice that would lead to a much more dangerous world and undo a great deal of progress.
I hear you. And yet in our lifetime, after World War II, we said never again. And yet, and you talked about the rules-based world order that formed, but we see Gaza, we see Sudan, we see Ukraine. I mean, we see these absolutely devastating, horrific wars ongoing. What does that say about human behavior and humanity if we are repeating history over and over again?
Well, the opinions vary a lot on this. I tend to think that pretty much everybody has something for which they will be willing to use violence. Somebody comes to the door to murder your family, you're probably going to be willing to use violence to prevent that from happening. And there are 8 billion or so people in the world nowadays. It would be quite amazing if we were at a point where nobody anywhere in the world was willing to use horrific violence to solve their problems. So I think just pointing and saying, yeah, there are terrible things out there happening, which obviously is true. Just pointing at those, I don't think really helps us answer this question.
Do you agree it's been a period of stability and that people
No,
can't get away with
I
war
don't.
anymore unless it's
I mean,
self-defense?
so I think there's a big sort of missing factor here, which is the racial and socioeconomic aspect of the way that wars are fought around the world. So whereas it may be true that there's been prevention of war in the classical sense in Europe and North America, it is absolutely not the case in most of the world. I'm talking about our region in the Arab world, but also Africa and Asia. I mean, there are so many wars that are happening and that have not been prevented. And so I think this narrative of progress only really applies to quite frankly, the white Western world, which ironically, but perhaps also not ironically, is largely responsible for a lot of the wars that are taking place in the rest of the world. And so that's sort of my initial response to this. And again, I want to go back to what I was trying to say earlier, is that I think it's impossible to extract the act or acts of war from the broader sociopolitical and socioeconomic context within which these wars are fought. This, just because a war has ended doesn't mean it actually has ended, because of the reverberations, which is why I think that it's difficult. I don't see how you can assess the impact or even the trajectory of war without taking into account these millions and millions of so-called indirect deaths of war.
Israel is held up to a unique moral standard in the world that no other state has ever been held up to, where it is under constant attack, where its existence is militarily and diplomatically
it has committed genocide without being sanctioned by anyone.
When it defends itself, it is held to a unique standard.
They acknowledge it. If you deny it, that's fine. But the Israelis do acknowledge it. They defend it. 80% of the society are saying this is legitimate, what they are doing to the men and women and children, not only to Hamas fighters. So basically, I don't know. I mean, denial now is not an issue. Beit Salim is an Israeli respected human rights organization. They published a huge document documenting everything, and they concluded that this is genocide. Haaretz, a newspaper, Israeli newspaper, very prominent intellectuals in Israel, scholars, journalists, they said this is genocide. So basically, to say now that what's happening right now in Palestine is not a genocide, what then is it?